Eduardo Alfonso. And yesterday we tackled topics from Che and Fidel's legacy to Cuba and Africa, to cooperatives and sustainability in Cuba today, to Cuba's struggle for furthering lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, to discussing communism and Marxism and its relevancy today. So it was an amazing day yesterday, and we're looking forward to a great day today as well. We have talks on U.S.-Cuba relations, on Che Guevara and his economic ideas, on Cuba's economic and social changes after the 2011 Economic and Social Guidelines, on Cuba's electoral system and democracy, on building Venezuela solidarity and the solidarity between the people of Venezuela and people of Cuba. And to summarize, in our closing today, we'll be discussing the major theme of this year's conference, from the Russian Revolution to the Cuban Revolution, the question of leadership, implementing the socialist project, and where we are today. So it's going to be a great day. We have great food, good company, and I just wanted to again thank Skyline Espresso, our friend Lauren there at the back, who's gotten us all going with some great espressos and macchiatos this morning. We thank him for donating his time and his coffee and helping us all feel ready for a good day of discussion and debate. So in order to welcome you today, we're very honored to have with us here Chief Bob Chamberlain. He is the Vice President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. He is also an elected Chief Councillor of the Kwakiutl Nation. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sure you can correct me. And we had Bob Chamberlain speak when we had Gerardo Hernandez, one of our Cuban 5 heroes in Vancouver. And I was very touched by his talk at that event, where he made an amazing connection between the struggles of Indigenous people in Canada today and the struggle of the Cuban 5 as political prisoners, and the role that Cuba is playing in the world. And it was just a really great and inspiring talk, connecting a bunch of issues that I feel are extremely important to be discussing in Canada today. So we were very honored to invite him back and that he accepted. And I'd like to turn over the floor to Bob Chamberlain this morning and welcome him up on here on stage. Thank you. Unless you prefer to sit.
No, I'll stay.
Okay.
Oh, can I take this off?
Yes, let's
Okay.
do that. Perfect. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Na begelikas la hamas lo klate. Nu guam oedi gaias ten la ka kwakosutinu khwatmis muskama zaudeno. Gelikas la masquim slavetith squatmis la kuktamas wheatla megas nunwakos quatnala. Awe gachens hutli lachela man watla puntnala. Leman watlam khas kainam loklatle khas Canada. My traditional name is Owadi, and I'm from the Kwekwasutinu Khwatmis people. And our broader collective is the Muskamag Zaudenoch people. And Mu in our language is 4, so Muskamag, there's 4 nations in our collective. And I've asked you, or first I've recognized the unceded territory that we find ourselves on. And I've mentioned 3 nations because as many of us experience as First Nations and more Canadians are coming to understand is the interconnectedness between all First Nations people. And quite a number of years ago, I had the good fortune of being taken under the wing by several of my elders and taught how to sing our songs of our culture. To the point that one time I knew 300 songs. But now I know about 50 Supreme Court of Canada rulings in fairly good detail. And I think I might be able to sing 20 songs now, it's been so long. But one of the parts of that journey with my elder was an expression called Wheatla Megans Numbagwanama. And that essentially says, we are all one people. And along the journey of learning of our culture, I learned of the origin stories of our people. And this is not dissimilar to other people and other indigenous peoples found around the world. And what it does is it tells our story. It tells of the creation of our people and the lands that we come from. Of course, today in modern context, that defines our Aboriginal title lands. And what we've always done in our territories is called Aboriginal rights here in Canada. But the important piece for me that my Uncle Michael, he was probably about this tall, so I used to refer to him as a giant of a man of average size. And when I first started being with me, he says, my name is Michael Miles Patrick Michelle Van Dyck III. And I never really, even upon his passing, I didn't know if that was really his name. I mean, he said it with such authority, I believed him. And he was a nurse for 32 years. He was a very articulate man, and he walked in both parts of our reality. And I have to tell you, I love telling stories. You may have gathered that, but Uncle Michael told me once, he was born on the banks of the Kinkum River in a canoe. And I thought about that, and he said there was an eagle flying over top. And I thought, I don't care who you are, it's tough to be more Indian than that, I thought, you know. But I told that story to one of my other elders, Uncle Tsipo, and he said, yeah, me too, but it was a seagull, he said, that flew over. But it was, I mean, the lesson that I was taught by these wonderful men is that not one of our origin stories is more important than any other origin story. And that really underlined that Wheatla Megans Numbagwanama, that we are one people. And you know, what little I understand and what I know of the man that we're here celebrating today, is he understood that very fact very clearly. And the boundaries, he did not place boundaries upon himself to help everybody. And that is beyond admiration. It just demands respect that someone would look out for the benefit of all the people. And that goes, no wonder why Western man struggles with that, because you know what that's like. And our people, our experience with the visitors that came has not been very productive. Because if we embrace the concept that the Western civilization brings, the richer I am, the bigger my car is, the vacations I take, the more wealthy I am. And yet the foundation of the Musqueam Dzaoudeno people's culture is something called the pasa. And in Chinook jargon, that's called a potlatch. And so when the visitors arrived and watched us do what we do as people, as the Creator has given us the direction to do, it completely baffled them, because here's this chief hosting everybody and giving everything he owns away to everybody else. And the anthropologists like to call that reverse reciprocity. But what it was a leader looking after his people, a leader making sure that all the needs of his community were met. And not just his own, but in the exercise of his cultural obligations, he invited neighboring First Nations to come that had other different origin stories. And it was an opportunity for the leader to demonstrate the family ties with all of these different communities and different nations. Again, further strengthening the unity of the Kwakwaka'wakw people beyond one chief of one tribe. And so the other chiefs would do the very same thing. But you can see how that goes very much against the Western civilization view of, look at my big car and my big bank account. And yet our chiefs were looking to get rid of everything to make sure that everybody had their needs met. And so that was the path that, excuse me, I really enjoyed the double espresso I had just moments before coming up here. So if you see me running around very soon, you'll understand why. But when that was the experience at the very beginning of Canada, where they didn't understand our ways, and yet our ways included welcoming them, our ways included helping them settle in, And their way was to implement a governance system that put themselves at a higher level of evolution and to displace our people from our lands and make great, vast wealth from our lands and our territories, and making sure that we did not have that same opportunity. Thank you. I think get another espresso. And so when I know that as the reality of how Canada began, every time I hear the national anthem, "Oh Canada," that's what I think, "Oh Canada," right? They didn't quite get it right. Because I was explaining, my son's here with me, and we were talking at length this morning about how Canada became what it is, and how the very foundation of this country is based upon two very basic principles of racism. And this is a really difficult conversation for Canadians to have, because the way that we show ourselves around the world is we're a fair and just and inclusive society, a beacon of hope for places where there's oppression. And yet when you look at what really makes Canada, Canada, it's very disgustingly racist. Because you'll find that the Crown asserts its authority over the lands because they were terra nullius, which means vacant lands. I mean, I'm pretty sure they saw us all around our territories when they arrived, but they called it vacant lands because of the doctrine of discovery. So we were not evolved enough to be considered human. I'm not sure how you feel about that, but I feel that that's really racist, and I can't see how that anything that comes from those two basic building blocks can be anything other than oppressive and racist. Because now we have governance in Canada and mechanisms and institutions built upon that very foundation. And so they hold all the decision-making amongst themselves and their own concept of the world at the expense of ours. And one thing that I say to Canadians when I have an opportunity, much like today, to speak to people, is when you see First Nations in the courthouse, when you see First Nations at roadblocks, when you see us protesting, by and large, what we're doing is pointing at the failings of democracy in Canada. We're pointing at the failings of the federal and provincial governments to live up to its very own laws and constitution. And I've said to every Canadian I can, that should be a concern for everybody. And if you recall back when apartheid was operational in South Africa, I don't know if enough Canadians understand that that government came to Canada to study the reserve system so they could modify it and implement it as apartheid. And I recall at that time as a young man, seems so long ago now, but I remember that in the concept of democracy, that the people of South Africa that were of color were not people because they couldn't vote. And yet I think of Canada, and First Nations people were not given the vote until the late 1950s, early 60s. And so it's not some far off, long ago time that Canada was implementing this racist attitudes towards our people. And yet it continues today. Which brings me to the opportunity in front of First Nations today, where the federal government has embraced to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And now that we have a new government here in British Columbia that's offered to do the very same thing. But it demands, if they're going to actually accomplish the implementation of this very important document, which collectively describes the minimum standard for human rights, not just Aboriginal rights. Certainly it's focusing on Indigenous people, but it talks of the human rights. And so now that we have a government that's grown up on terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery and all the institutions that flow from that, we're talking about a fundamental change to the governance structure of Canada. And I think it's freaking a lot of people out. In the government, outside the government, industry. As I know as a First Nations person or a leader, when I've engaged with the provincial and federal governments in the consultation and accommodation of our people's Aboriginal rights, there has never been the acceptance of the answer no. There is never in that system contemplated the answer no. So whatever the government and industry comes and talks to our people about, the answer is already yes, but we'll deal with your little rights as some measure of inconvenience, where the picture will stay the same, but we might put different corners on the frame. And so that's the reality that we've faced as First Nations for generations, and it took a lot of fighting to get even to that level. And so now that the UN Declaration speaks of free, prior, and informed consent, a lot of the fear-mongering in Canada now is you have people that aren't so open-minded saying, well, does that give them Indians a veto on projects? But they won't understand that the veto against our rights was already in place for generations within Canada. And so if we truly want to be a fair, just, and open society and country to be proud of internationally, we must build processes that anticipate and allow for any outcome of a process, not a predetermined outcome, which has been the experience of First Nations people. So the challenge is now in front of us on both sides of the table for the government to make those mechanisms that they've relied upon for generations and industry has gotten very comfortable with for generations and change them. But what it also demands, the responsibility it places upon ourselves as First Nations people, is to understand the opportunity and to honestly evaluate our own governance structures and be brutally honest about the shortcomings of what we have in place. And so how is it then do we create something which is going to make the maximum benefit for our people with the new political opportunity here in Canada? And this is, I'm not sure about how all of you feel. When I have to make a change about something, it takes a bit of work. And I'm one of those 12-step people, one of those sobriety guys. And so my sponsor always said to me, he says, does everything you let go have to have big claw marks on it? Right, because I just get so comfortable in doing things a certain way. And then when I get honest and realize it's not working, I have to make change, but then I go back to being comfortable again. And it's this vacillating back and forth between before I finally heard enough that I make the changes that are necessary. And that's my personal journey. And I think Canada is going to go through the very same thing because they know now, and they're demonstrating the willingness to understand beyond Aboriginal rights, to look at it as basic human rights. And fundamental things, not, I mean, the Canadian society is focusing on our authority and our territories. Why do I want our people to have authority in our territories? So my son can understand what our lands mean to us as people. So the salmon are there for us to do what we've always done. The clams are there to do what we've always done. The cod, the deer, everything that makes up our territory, which informs our identity in a very clear way, is available for the next generations. And that's not a selfish view. That's a very loving, caring, respectful way of ensuring that what I've enjoyed with my elders in our territories and our resources is there for future generations to do the very same. And that way, the other pieces of the UN Declaration are realized, where the culture, values, traditions, teachings, education of our children are all realized in decision-making relating to the territories. And this is where what I understand and what I've learned about the UN Declaration is you can't just pick one and say this is what we're doing. You must consider the overall entire concept found within that document to look after our peoples and to make sure that we're no better or no worse than any other people in the world. And isn't that a wonderful goal? I believe that is what the man we're celebrating today wanted, is that equality, and to make sure that we all had the things that we needed, and if we had them, not at the expense of our neighbor, so we could all enjoy this human experience in the best way possible, and remove that opportunity of stepping on people so I could see over the fence. It's about all of us seeing over the fence. And so I'm very happy to have been invited back to come and speak. I rarely ever turn down an opportunity to speak to Canadians. The political aspirations of the federal and provincial government today is about political reconciliation, about the reconciling of laws and legislation. I believe not too many Canadians live in a world of policy, legislation, and regulation, but First Nations do. And if we know that this is a just path that needs to be accomplished, we have to bring Canadians along with us. Because if you've read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed like I have, if you don't bring the oppressors with you, it's going to fail. And so we must educate Canadians to support why Canada is going to fundamentally change its decision-making structures and processes and create the proper space for First Nations people to have their views shared. Can I tell a joke?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to tell a joke. What do you call a fish with one eye missing?
What?
Fish. Isn't that sad? I've told that joke way too many times. And to be honest, I was at a family birthday party, and I was really lucky that I arrived late because there was only one chair left, and it was with the kids. So I told that joke, and this one little girl, she was about 9 years old, looked at me immediately and went, "Fish." So I looked at her, I said, "You could be chief." The one thing I love about being Indigenous is our sense of humor. And I know that without it, we'd be dead. And one of the things that I keep hearing, and I know many of you have heard as well, is you must maintain the ability to laugh at oneself. Well, that's really easy for me because I have a lot of material to work with. But it's about staying grounded, about staying equal. And I recall going to a neighboring nation and watching their cultural experience and what they did. And the person that was being worked on or initiated into their culture, when he was finished or she was finished that process, they would have a black face. And when I was in their big house, there was probably 400 people inside, all with the black face makeup. And I thought, what a wonderful way to make everybody equal. Because what the person that was being initiated was experiencing, everybody else in that big house experienced the very same. And I found it to be quite fascinating to see the deep spiritual connection of that cultural work. Can I sing a song, Ken? Yeah. You sure? Yeah. Please? Yeah. I'm just kidding. I've shared the thoughts that I thought would be of benefit, and I hope that they're of some value. What I'd like to do is end my presentation with a song. In our culture, we have a yalakwala, and you sing this kind of a song when things have gone well, and there's been no mistakes. So I'm going to be so brave as to say that things went well and I didn't make any mistakes. So I'd like to share with you a short song just to end the time that I have with you today.
Yeah.
Oh, we're getting real
Look
smart.
at technological there.
Look at that.
Thank you.
No, give me a hug.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Ooh, okay, that was close. Thank you so much to Chief Bob Chamberlain for opening our conference this morning in such a beautiful way. I think that he made some very important calls on us as people living in Canada and some of us visiting from the United States as well to think about when we think about talking about a better world is possible and a better world is necessary, what that's going to mean for people living in Canada to reach out to Indigenous people and to listen to what is happening in their communities, to listen to what has happened in the past and what is happening today and what needs to be rectified and what needs to be changed. And I think that was very powerful. It reminded me a bit of a quote from Che Guevara, who were here to commemorate at our 7th International Che Guevara Conference. And it's actually in the text of Socialism and Man in Cuba, which is on the side wall today, where he says that capitalism is a contest among wolves. You only get ahead at the cost and expense of others. And that is unfortunately a lot of the society that we live in, is the more we compete against each other, the more we put other people down, we're able to buy things from the dollar store because someone in China or Bangladesh is not being paid properly. We're able to, consume the things that we are able to here because this land was stolen from the Coast Salish people. And so we have a lot of responsibility to work for justice and for equality worldwide, not only within Canada, but around the world. Someone pointed out to me that that quote by Che Guevara is not fair to wolves, who actually are not very competitive and work together very well. And I said, yes, that's true. However, I think that it's very fair to say that the capitalist system that we have today is not sustainable for the environment and is not sustainable for humanity. And so we have a lot of work to do to change and to build that better world that we believe is possible and necessary. So thank you again. Yes. All right. Welcome back up. Yeah. Okay.
Got to get a selfie with everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you again, and for being here with us this morning. And I'm looking forward to a very good day this afternoon at our Che Guevara conference. So I would now like to invite up our opening keynote address, which is going to be Arnold August speaking on Cuba-U.S. relations, Obama and beyond. Arnold August is a researcher and author, and he has written 3 books, Democracy in Cuba and the 1997 to 98 elections in Cuba, Cuba and its neighbors, Democracy in Motion, and Cuba-U.S. relations, Obama and beyond. He contributes articles in English, French, and Spanish to many different news media, both online and in print. And since 1997, he spent extended periods in Cuba investigating Cuba's electoral system. So we're hugely honored to have Arnold here with us. He's just arrived from Montreal this morning, and so let's give him a warm welcome.
He's taller. Yeah. Okay. Chief Bob Chamberlain, representing the First Nations. Tanya Lopez Larocque, Chief of Mission, the Consul General of the Cuban Consulate in Toronto. Wilfred Perez, Chief of Mission, Consul General of the Venezuelan Consulate in Vancouver. Luis Morlotti Rivas, First Vice President of UNIAC, and through him, Miguel Barnett, who is the President of UNIAC. Before starting, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference by giving them a small present. They're not here, but I'll give it to all of you. I just returned from Havana, and I saw this in the airport, and so I bought this book, Cartas de Despedida, Letters of Farewell by Che Guevara. It was just published this year. And another one, The Thought of Che. So this is my small present in recognition of your great work and your hospitality. When I go back to Havana in February, I'll make sure that I bring more books because the Havana Book Fair is taking place, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of books in Spanish about Che Guevara. I know that you're all interested in that, and I'll bring it back to you, and I'll ship it from Montreal to Vancouver. I won't wait till the next Che Guevara conference. And so I'll be speaking about my latest book, Cuba-U.S. Relations, Obama and Beyond. Of course, the Beyond, we're already in the Beyond, and it includes Trump, which I deal with in the book. Now, this book, the introduction to the book is written by Ricardo Alarcón. The title of the introduction is, in English, Not One Iota. He very well captured the main theme of my book, or one of the main themes of the book. The original in Spanish by Che Guevara is ni un tantico así. That is, we cannot have faith in the United States, ni un tantico así. But you cannot translate ni tantico así into English. Why? Because Cubans have that body language of that, not 1 centimeter. While in English, we just say, not one iota, but the message is there. And I'm very grateful for this introduction because he grasps one of the main themes in this book, and that is supporting and working with flexible tactics between Cuba and the United States, but not giving in 1 iota on the question of principles. Now, I'm very honored to have, in addition to this introduction, the foreword written by Keith Ellis, who is quite well known here in Canada, as well internationally in Cuba. Now, when I asked him to write the foreword, I knew he would do a very good job, but what he wrote was beyond my expectations. In my book, of course, I deal with the blockade, etc., but I also deal with some aspects that are not really dealt with in other books, whether from Cuba, United States, or elsewhere. And that is the question of the cultural war led by the United States against Cuban socialist culture. By cultural war, I mean culture in the large aspect of the term, including artistic, ideology, and politics. Now, in my book, as I'll explain in a few minutes, I deal with the, what I call, the cultural invasion during and after the Obama visit to Cuba in March 2016 with regards to various activities such as the Rolling Stone concert and others. Now, to my surprise, when I read his foreword, he really knows about rock and Cuba. It's really, I think it's worthwhile to get this book just to read his foreword, because he deals with the question of rock in Cuba that not very many people know about. He deals with other cultural issues as well. And it widens the scope of my book in dealing with the question of cultural invasion of Cuban socialist culture. And there's another aspect of his introduction, his prologue, that I like very much, and that is he has spent a lot of time in Cuba. Now, he narrates some anecdotes in day-to-day life in Cuba that he experienced as a visitor. Now, the way, as a poet, he renders these anecdotes in such a fantastic way that it further develops and defends Cuba's socialist culture. So that is another aspect of the book. That is the foreword itself by Keith Ellis. Now, before going into the book itself, I'd like to share with everyone here what we call, like, if it was a film, it's you know, what happened behind the scenes, the making of. In this case, how did this book come about? It was a pretty difficult situation. Here it is. Around in the end of October 2016, the third or fourth version of the manuscript was completed. End of October 2016, ready to go to the publisher for final copy editing in order to be published as soon as possible in the spring of 2017. However, the book was basically oriented towards based on the Obama policy towards Cuba, taking for granted that Hillary Clinton would win the elections. But I was wrong. I'm not the only one that was wrong. Trump won the elections. So I had to go back to the drawing board, go back to the manuscript, not rewrite the whole thing, but adjust it and take into account the fact that Trump won the elections and that he will definitely have a different policy towards Cuba compared to Hillary Clinton. And I very quickly, in a matter of several weeks, I analyzed the Trump policy on Cuba. I will be dealing with this more in detail. In fact, on November 1st, here, when I deal with do the book launch at the People's Co-op bookstore at 6:30 p.m. That talk is devoted to the Trump-Cuba policy. Now, this was, you know, updated, and then another event took place. But I have to mention, I can't mention the other event in the same breath as I did the one with regards to Trump. It reminds me when Hugo Chavez famously said on the podium of the United Nations several years ago, speaking right after Bush, that the sulfur from Bush the devil still smells here on the podium. So he waited a while, and he started again. I'm doing the same thing. We have to forget about Trump, and the other incident that took place is entirely different. That is the death of Fidel Castro on November 25th, 2016. Now, immediately, right after the news came public, there was a major media blitzkrieg against Cuba. But I actually have chapter 7 in my book that came out of this. And what it was a blitzkrieg as we haven't seen in many years, saying Fidel Castro was a dictator, Cuba is a dictatorship, and now that he's gone, Cuba will come to its senses. And of course, the main message was that Fidel Castro was against the opening of Cuba towards the United States. That Fidel Castro was against the changes going on today in Cuba. Now, in my book, chapter 7, I think everyone who's involved in the solidarity work would find this a useful tool. Because on both these things, that Fidel Castro was against opening of relations with United States, I completely take that whole argument apart with facts. That Fidel Castro was against the changes going on in Cuba today, I also take all that apart. And so I came up with this last chapter, updated. It's called The Death of Fidel Castro and the US-led blitzkrieg on the question of dictatorship. Now, we have to go back to the beginning of the book at this time. As of course, when it came out, it was updated with these events. Now, chapter 1 of the book deals with the background to the current situation. And I point out very clearly, based on facts of my study, that the US policy toward Cuba began with the very notions established by the Pilgrims in the 17th century. That is, United States is a chosen people. The United States is like a beacon on the hill, and people of the world have to look up to the United States for salvation. This has been the basic policy that the United States has developed in foreign policy from then up until now, and it also, of course, applies to Cuba, even more so, because right from the beginning, from the very first presidents of the United States, they all considered Cuba should be a natural appendage part of the United States. In the same way, of course, they think that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So if you don't, you have to, if you want to understand U.S. policy towards Cuba, you have to go back to the 17th century to now. Of course, the form changes a lot, but the basic principle exists. Now, as I quote in my book, William Shakespeare said in 2-3 words, history is but the prologue for today. That is, if you want to know today, you have to know history. And that is why I deal with this specifically in that first chapter. Now, in addition to this aspect of the U.S. foreign policy, I also deal with what I think is a very important point. When Obama visited Cuba in March 2016, there were several controversial issues that came up. One was the use of the race card in Cuba. A lot of my colleagues in Cuba have pointed this out, that he went out of his way to use the race card in Cuba in order to win people, certain sections of the population, over to the side of the U.S. American dream. He also, very deftly, eliminated Cuba as, the history of Cuba. He said openly on several occasions in Havana and before and after that, Cuba, forget about history, forget about the past. Let's look to the future. Okay? Of course, it's very difficult for Cuba to forget about the past after more than 50 years of blockade, terrorist attacks, Playa Girón, and ongoing attacks against Cuba. Now, the point is that it's nothing new in terms of Obama's policy towards Cuba. When he went, in one of these chapters, points in his book, when he went to Brazil in 2011, in the first few years of his mandate, he openly used the race card in Brazil, playing soccer with, poor Afro-Brazilians in the favelas, and trying to give the impression, actually saying that anyone in this favela can achieve the American dream and become president of Brazil, etc., etc. Then he went on to Chile. Chile is an example of forgetting history. He went and he spoke, amongst others, in Chile in 2011 as well, at the Moneda, which is the presidential palace, where Salvador Allende was killed in the course of the U.S. coup d'etat in 1973 against Chile. And he said, well, there's been some, misunderstandings between the United States and Chile, and there's been, Chile has sort of come out of this and has become more and more democratic, completely obliterating the fact that the U.S., including his own party, the Democratic Party, and others, were involved in the coup d'etat in Chile, responsible for the deaths of imprisonment and torture of thousands of people. It would not even have been on the agenda if it was not for a Chilean journalist who had the guts to ask Obama, well, what about the coup d'etat? Aren't you going to, sort of apologize for that? Should not be reparations to the Chilean people for what happened in Chile? Of course, Obama wasn't expecting that, because I've done some work on this as well. The White House always has their plants, their newspaper plants, when they go around on these trips. For example, when Obama was in Havana in 2016, he had a CNN plant, okay, in the press corps, whose first question, recognized by Obama, was to Raul Castro about political prisoners. This is how they operate, but in Santiago de Cuba, it didn't work out. Someone actually came up first to raise the issue of the question of the coup d'etat in Chile. And so these are some of the things I deal with in the background to Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, I deal with the period around, like from December 2014, when Presidents Raúl Castro and Obama announced the opening of diplomatic relations, the reopening of diplomatic relations, as well as the embassies in their respective capitals. So I deal with this quite in some detail, dealing with the issue, for example, democracy, when the embassy was open in Havana, what Kerry said about Cuba needing real democracy, human rights, and a variety of things that took place during that important year and a half while the preparations were going on for the visit to Havana, as well as during the actual visit and after the visit. Now, later on in Chapter 3, I think Chapter 3 is the best chapter. Why? Because I didn't write it. No, really, Chapter 3 consists, it's very original, of interviews with 5 Cuban experts on Cuba-U.S. relations in Havana, living in Havana, working in Havana. I went to Havana and asked them questions, separate interviews, not based on what I wanted to ask, but I was thinking of everyone else in Canada. What would they want to ask these Cuban experts with regards to Cuba-U.S. relations? And so, for example, I asked, what was your reaction when the announcement was made on December 17, 2014. Were you surprised? Were you expecting it? So you have a variety of responses to that. Very interesting. I also asked each of them, what was their reaction when Fidel Castro wrote his famous reflection called Brother Obama, in response, among other things, to Obama's assertion that Cuba should forget history. And I deal with various other things. For example, there's a very well-known blogger, Iriel Sanchez, whose work fascinates me. And I asked him, well, I noticed in his blog, he has one blog, 2-3 posts a day, and he himself takes part in the comments on these posts. So I said, well, what does your day work look like? How do you get all this done on your own? So he explains that to me. And you know, readers have that right in front of them, how he deals with his specific blog. So, and I just want to emphasize, there are 5 different specialists, but they do not all have the same line, the same position. Of course, you have to read it carefully, read the 5 interviews carefully, and you will see there are differences in the opinion of all 5 of them. And I think this is one of the main features of that chapter. One of the things that I like a lot is my interview with Luis Toledo Sandy. I connected with him several years ago when he wrote articles with regards to the appearance, the growing appearance of Cuban flags on the clothing of young Cubans. And I was thinking the same thing when I went to Havana. I noticed this looks pretty strange for a Canadian. We don't have that many people walking around with them. We have no one walking around with American flags on our clothing, but in Havana it became more and more apparent and even increased after the Obama visit. So he wrote articles, I wrote articles, and based on his analysis, I was able to further develop my view on the issue of this type of cultural incursion. Now, Chapter 4 takes off from the more recent period, from 2016, 2017 on. And I review the points that I did in the Chapter 2, but this time dealing more specifically with some very hot topics. Let me give you just one example, and that is in April, May of 2016, right after the Obama visit, there were 3 what I call cultural incursions. One was the arrival of a cruise ship, an American cruise ship in Havana Harbor. Now, out to greet them was this was organized, a small group of Cuban dancers, but for the first time that I ever saw it, dressed with clothing of the Cuban flag. So this is never seen before. You know, if people who know Cuban culture, you just don't wear the Cuban flag to work out sort of a stereotype view of what Americans should see when they come to Cuba. Rumba dancers wearing Cuban flags. Now, I wasn't very impressed with that, but I was very happy to see that the very next day, UNIAC came out with a very strong statement against this. And then others followed as well, important journalists in Juventud Rebelde and Grama, etc., with regards to this particular manifestation of what I call cultural aggression. And then, of course, you have the Chanel Félix de Mode, a model. What is it called in English? I forget. Défilé de mode is... yeah, anyways, it's a... I caught up with 3 languages. Anyways, Chanel does these with models, over several hundred models brought in from France and taking only 3 or 4 Cuban models, and had a huge parade of dressing and all that according to their view of what dressing should be. Now, it took over the whole area, and this also created a backlash in the Cuban media, including Juventud Rebelde and Grama and others, that what's happening here. And then there was something else as well, and that is next was the filming of the film Fast and Furious. That also created a lot of controversy because a lot of money was spent on that, and it was never really sure how this helps Cuba. But the one I dealt with most, and the most controversy of all, was the Rolling Stone conference, the Rolling Stone concert in Havana. Now, raising this Havana, any criticism of that is not very popular. Everyone I spoke to in Havana, members of the party, members of the youth, everyone loved the idea of the Rolling Stone concert in Havana. But I went into it further. The point of what I analyzed in the book, like what came out of it, and the basic analysis was not the concert as such, but rather the professional documentary film that was produced with Havana as the set, as the backdrop, and viewed all over the world. And so I'm not a film critic, but I had to convert myself into a film critic. I went to a theater in Montreal, and I watched it. And my whole analysis as an amateur film critic is there. And the basic view that is presented is negative with regards to Cuba. So this is what came out of that one. And this is not very well known in Cuba, because of course that documentary is not shown in Cuba, but I deal with it. So this whole issue, this whole invasion, April, May, etc., is what I call the new, like hipster colonialism. It's not colonialism of the Playa Girón type or another. It's hipster colonialism. It's to be cool and to introduce the colonialist or Western vision of things through the use of culture. And there are very other things I deal with in that chapter. For example, what I call the whole issue when Obama was here was in Havana in March 2016. He spoke to what they call cuentapropistas, or small business people, small private business owners. And of course, there he invited them to come to the United States to develop their talent as entrepreneurs. Now the point is, they organized a special conference in Silicon Valley in California, where these private owners were invited, and in order to be trained to become good capitalists in Cuba, with the basic view that this will help American influence in Cuba and bring at least a section of the Cuban population on the side of the U.S.-American dream. Now, that's why I call this specific subtitle Havana, Silicon Valley, Havana, the making of a Trojan horse, and that's what it is. It is a making of a Trojan horse. And I deal with various other of these things, and of course, question of participatory democracy in Cuba, etc. Now, I also deal with the blockade. I'm coming here by car. Some of the comrades mentioned to me that there's been some discussion of the blockade, but there's a need for more discussion on the blockade, especially Trump's attitude toward the blockade. As I said, I'll be dealing with that in detail on November 1st at 6:30. But allow me to say that this chapter that I changed the name, the blockade from Obama to Trump. My basic analysis with regards to Trump is that, and I had to write this in several weeks, 3 weeks, but I think it's proven to be right, that Trump is going to be caught between two different forces or two different things in his head. One is his instinct as a business person to just do business as usual, not to raise any ideological issues. And it looked that he was going to do that way. In fact, before I quote some of his talks before, he has mentioned on several occasions that he would like to build a Trump Tower in Cuba, open up a golf resort in Cuba. When he went to Miami, he gave another talk, anti-communist talk, the need to change things in Cuba according to his will. But this point that he is caught, the point is that Trump is still, despite all the changes that he's brought about, he is still caught between these two opposing forces. Ideology from Marco Rubio and others, and the business section of the United States. Now, I give you concrete facts in detail how, despite what Trump may want to do, or especially the Republican in Miami want to do, there are powerful forces in the United States that want to not only maintain the Obama policy of trade and travel, but they want to go farther and lift the blockade altogether like we want to do. And they include, for example, the Midwestern states, agricultural states in the United States that voted for Trump, but they're interested in selling their products to Cuba for their own, to develop their own income. I give you another example. The question, Texas is an important state, right? Now, right after, and it's led by Republicans, there's an important coalition of Republicans and Democrats and business people in Texas. Right after Trump was elected, they wrote him a letter saying, hey, Trump, if you want to make America great again, let's keep on trading with Cuba because we'll have more jobs in Texas. And there are many other, and this is important, for example, the Texas ports are the closest ports to Havana than any other ports in the United States. Then there's the travel agency. He has to travel industry. He has to deal with the B&B types, the major airline industries. Expedia, which is not a small player in terms of all of them want increased trade and travel with Cuba. So, of course, we saw in the last few weeks that he made a major change in terms of diplomatic relations. But I still maintain, and this could be, we'll see how it works out, he did everything except one thing. He did not break relations with Cuba. He did not yet shut down both embassies. And I think that this is a compromise that he reached. So that Cuban Americans, he had this speech on June 16th in Miami with a lot of rhetoric. And I saw the face on Rubio. He didn't look too happy, despite the rhetoric, because Trump did not do what the Republicans in Miami wanted him to do. That is to break relations and shut down the embassy. So this is still playing out. That's my basic view, my analysis in the book. And I think it's pretty much correct. I think that he will not break relations with Cuba. So we'll see what is going to happen in the future. Then I deal with a lot of other issues with regards to the blockade under Obama and now under Trump. What I would like to emphasize here with regards to the blockade, which is one of the reasons that we're here over this weekend and demonstrating November 1st all around the world, is that the blockade is part of U.S. policy. I participated in a very interesting symposium a few days ago in Havana, whereby Cuban revolutionary experts spoke with regards to Cuba-U.S. relations. And many of them said the following: look, American hostility to Cuba, it is a state policy. It doesn't matter who is in the White House. It is a state policy developed since 1959 based on either open aggression and or subversion. Only the form changes. It's very clear. We had one form in the term of Obama and another form in terms of Trump. But the basic policy of the United States toward Cuba is subversion and interference. That does not change. I think it will be there as long as U.S. imperialism exists. But the Cuban government has experience, vast experience from 1959, the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how to deal with the United States in complicated situation. Obama opened up, okay, we'll take advantage of it. At the same time, not having any illusions with regard to the long-term policy of the United States. And this is one of the main themes in the book. I like to deal with it now. I point out from the beginning right to the end. Obama said when relations opened up in December 2014, when it was announced, what he said very clearly was, the blockade was a mistake, it didn't work. But that's not all he said. You have to read the second sentence after that. He said that the blockade did not work because, one, our goal to subvert the revolution in Cuba, or what he says, open Cuba up, open the market of Cuba up so it becomes capitalist, that it becomes democratic, that is, has a multi-party system, that did not work. So we have to have change tactics in order to allow us to achieve that objective with regards to converting Cuba toward a market economy or capitalism, or converting Cuba into what I call from a one-party system to a multi-party system, etc. Now, the other thing that did not work, and Obama is the one who said it, we did not succeed. We wanted to isolate Cuba from the rest of Latin America. And then he said, well, the opposite took place. The United States was isolated, and Cuba got more support from the rest of Latin America. So this is the basic, one of the main themes that I hammer away at the book. I do hammer away with it, because I don't think that it would be appropriate to say that Cuba, the United States, open relation with Cuba, and we're on the path towards normalization. What kind of normalization is this? All he changed was some aspects of the blockade, diplomatic relations with Cuba, and opening of the embassies. That's all. The blockade remained. He fined more companies than any other president previous to him. And there's so many other examples that I can mention to you. And the blockade is not a secondary thing. Why didn't he could have lifted the blockade in his first mandate when he had a majority in the Congress, but he didn't even move towards that. The same thing with regards to Guantanamo. He could have closed that down in his first mandate and deal with a very important roadblock in the real normalization of relations with Cuba. And the money that he spent on democracy promotion programs, which has its origins, as I explained in the book, in the 17th century pilgrim notion that the United States has the burden to bring democracy to the countries of the world, including Cuba, that has increased during his Obama administration. He went to Havana in March, and he said, well, I recognize the sovereignty of the Cuban nation. But right after that, he increased spending for democracy promotion program. So, of course, Trump, I've heard by the way that Trump has not yet allotted money for democracy promotion program. I'm not saying Trump is better, but the point is that if one looks at things objectively, it's all part of the same attitude or policy towards Cuba, based on the goal, the long-term goal of trying to convert Cuba into a colony of the United States, or have Cuba dependent on the United States, change its socialist culture to a capitalist culture, and the revolutionary political system to the multi-party system. So that is what it's all about. And anyways, I hope gave you a very quick overview of the whole process, what my book is all about. But in any case, if I have 2-3 minutes left, I'd like to read one recommendation of my book by a colleague of mine, because he just, in the UK, who just passed away several months ago. His name is Steve Ludlam. He was a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, a close friend of mine, and it was shocking to hear the news that he passed away. He just retired as a professor, and he was about to start a very important work as a retired person, going to Cuba and writing about Cuba. So I'd like to read this in the last minute that I have, and also dedicating it to Steve. He wrote the following. Arnold August's bristling collection of interventions vigorously debunks U.S.-centric misrepresentations of Cuban society and of Obama's new regime change strategy. It also engages critically with the Cuban intellectuals and bloggers fighting in the cultural war, challenging the revolution's cohesion since 2014, so-called normalization began. With its withering anti-imperialism and comradely criticism of Cuban realities, this timely book will open many eyes and raise many hackles. So if you're curious, that's great. Get the book and enjoy it. Thank you very much.
I want to apologize to Arnold. I've had to run around and do some organizing during his talk this morning, but I know that I left you all in good hands. Arnold is an excellent author and really a specialist on what's happening between the U.S. and Cuba and on Cuba's electoral system. So as he mentioned, we're going to be having a book signing later on in the program today, and he'll also be back for his workshop on Cuba, Democracy in Motion. And I want to thank him for bringing us these two beautiful books on Che Guevara to present to us at the conference, and I'll make sure to share them around so everyone can get a good look. So our technician is now connecting us with London, and we are very honored that we are connecting live with Helen Yaffe. Helen Yaffe is a fellow at the University of London and their School of Economics, and she's a fellow in economic history. She's also the author of the book Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, which is also available at our books table. She has worked on a variety of newspapers and publications and has presented papers at conferences and seminars around the world. And we're very honored that she's able to join us via Skype from London. And so we're just getting that all set up. So this morning, she's going to be giving our first workshop, and it's our fourth workshop in the conference, and it is titled Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, the same as her book. So we're very honored to have Helen here with us. How are we doing, Azza? Okay, all right. It seems our tech is all up. Wonderful. Okay, so there's Helen in the corner. She can't see all of you, but we can still give her a wave. And and we'll just get the sound up and begin with her. Oh, yes. And so, Helen, just so that you know as well, we are doing simultaneous translation for some of our Spanish speakers. So if you could just keep things slow, and that would be fantastic.
Okay.
All right.
Can you hear me?
All right. Can we hear her?
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Hello, Vancouver. Test, test. Test, test. Testing, testing. How is your microphone? Okay. What are you getting, like an echo? Okay. Do you think it's definitely your end? Yes, testing, testing. Okay. The only thing that's weird is I can hear my own voice like a second after I speak. Okay. 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 So, greetings from London. I want to start by saying a really big thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you in person, but it's great to be able to take part in the 7th International Conference on Che Guevara. Okay, so I'll be speaking a bit today about Che Guevara's economic ideas and his work in Cuba as a member of the Cuban government. It's the part of his life about which less is known, and in some ways it is his most important contribution to the Cuban Revolution and to socialism as well. So I'm going to start off with an overview. I'm sure many of your speakers have already addressed these issues, but I think it's really important to understand the situation in which Cuba found itself at the time when the revolution took place, in the 1950s, when the revolutionary movement was taking place, and the problem of underdevelopment and revolution. So Cuba had a semi-colonial status. It was a country that was dominated by United States interests. It also suffered from structural imbalances. So it had some very sophisticated and advanced technology, but surrounded by seas of underdevelopment. A lot of this technology was subsidiaries of US corporations, some of the oil refineries, for example. And because the economy was structured around the sugar industry, the particular characteristic of the sugar industry is that it employs people during the harvest, which at that time was around 4 months a year. And for the rest of the year, there is no alternative employment for those people, or, you know, just struggling to survive doing bits of work wherever they could. And that was known as their tiempo muerto, the dead period. So unemployment, poverty, inequality, and racism were endemic to the structure of the Cuban economy and Cuban society. So as you all know, Cuba was dominated by the monocrop, that was the sugar industry, but also dominated by its dependency on trade. So sugar and exports to the United States. Also, a huge proportion of its imports came from the United States. So this is the sort of structural context in which the Cuban Revolution took place in January 1959. We have to recognize that it was a multi-class popular revolution against dictatorship. However, it was very clear that there was a need for radical economic, political and social transformations in Cuba. And that was part of the program, the Moncada program of the movement for the 26th of July and Fidel Castro. But how can these radical economic, political and social transformations take place? How can the investments that have been promised in health, in education, in housing, in culture and so on, how can they take place when the country effectively has no money? The money in the country has been stolen. So literally, Batista's cronies filled up their suitcases with the money in the Cuban treasury, and they took it off to Miami and elsewhere. And this raises the question, the challenge that faced the new revolutionary government. How do you fund investments and how do you fund development? But beyond that, because the concern was about a new kind of society based on social justice, without racism and other forms of discrimination, how do you change consciousness and social relations? And that's a more difficult question in some ways. So this is what we can call the challenge of development. In a way, it's a challenge that faces all underdeveloped countries in the world to some extent. And the way that Che Guevara conceived the problem was this. The problem was, how do you achieve economic development with equity from a position of underdevelopment in a country also blockaded and attacked, but without relying on capitalist mechanisms which undermine the collective consciousness and new social relations integral to socialism and communism? Now, by capitalist mechanisms, we can understand things like the profit motive, competition, material incentives, interest, credit, and so on. And in terms of Che Guevara's capacity to address that problem, he had a number of really key roles. He was, first of all, the head of the Department of Industrialization in late 1959. 6 weeks later, he was named president of the National Bank of Cuba in November 1959. And then as the Department of Industrialization became so big through the process of nationalizations, Che Guevara became Cuba's first ever Minister of Industries, and he stayed in that role from 1961 to 65. And in addition to that, Che had many military, political and diplomatic roles. For example, when there was the Bay of Pigs invasion or Playa Girón and the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was the comandante who had to go to the west of Cuba. Okay, so the 1960s in Cuba was a period of turmoil and transition. But incredibly, despite this situation, Cuban industry actually stabilized, diversified, and grew. So there wasn't paralysis, there wasn't a crisis in industry. And that really is testimony to the economic analysis and organizational capacity and ability to mobilize resources and people that Che Guevara had. Now, Che's ideas in this period were influenced by three sources. And the first, perhaps most surprisingly to people who haven't studied his economic ideas, was the influence of capitalist corporations. And you can see there my little graphic of Charlie Chaplin from the film Modern Times. So as the US corporations in Cuba and their subsidiaries were nationalized and the government took control of them, Che Guevara himself actually sat down with the documentation from them and their files, and he studied the way they worked, and he was very interested in some of the centralized management techniques and centralized budgeting techniques which they had. So, for example, he noticed that if there were two subsidiaries which were passing goods from one to the other, they wouldn't be charging to make a profit from each other because actually they were subsidiaries of one company. And that was a key element that he took. But basically he believed that the advances made by humanity in terms of technology and techniques, so in this case management techniques, should be adopted without fear of ideological contamination. The second source of inspiration or source of theory for Che was obviously studying Marx. And that is both studying Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production in Capital, but also studying some of Marx's earlier work where he wrote, as Che said, more like a philosopher, where he talked about the human condition and so on. So the 1848 manuscripts. Now, when Che read Marx's Capital, the thing that struck him was the fundamental and central role of the law of value in the capitalist mode of production. And meanwhile, when he went on to read the Soviet manuals of political economy, he saw that as almost inexplicable why the Soviets were proposing that you should not only use or admit the continued existence of the law of value, but you should actually somehow develop the law of value while you're building socialism. So the Che Guevara and his contemporaries in Cuba were well aware of the debates that were taking place in the Soviet Union and the other Eastern European socialist blocs. He saw that debates that were trying to answer the question of why there was low productivity and stagnation were ending up with arguments for increased liberalisation, a move towards market socialism and so on. So they were well aware of those debates. And what we can take from looking at Che's work is that with these three different influences, his analysis of the law of value was integral to the economic management system which he created in Cuba in the Ministry of Industries, which was a unique system of economic management for the transition to socialism. And it was called the budgetary finance system. So his analysis of the law of value is integral to the budgetary finance system and all the practical policy formulations that come with it. He says, and I quote, "The law of value and planning are two terms linked by a contradiction and its resolution." So Che does not believe that the law of value should be what determines production and distribution in Cuba, but in fact planning. If there were to be a characteristic of socialism, it would be the central plan, state plan. Okay, so just to say a little bit more about what do we mean by the law of value, essentially this is the question of the plan versus the market. And this is a very stylized description. I'm sure there's many people there at the conference who know have spent many years studying capital and so on. But essentially, the law of value implies private ownership, production for exchange, the social division of labor, which means that, human beings are no longer producing under subsistence system. We're no longer producing just what we need to survive. We are producing with the knowledge that we are going to exchange our produce in a social context. And that labour power itself has become a commodity. And the question of the law of value goes to the heart of a debate about whether socialism is possible in a society or an economy that hasn't got the fully developed capitalist mode of production. As we know that Marx predicted that socialism, communism would arise out of the fully developed capitalist countries, and that's not what happened. So this leads to the question, where there has been socialist revolutions, of how to organise and direct the use of the social product. That's the product, as I said, we're producing for exchange. How do we organise and direct the use of that? And it's linked to the problem of underdevelopment and scarcity. If we had a massive abundance of goods, everyone could receive what they needed. But while there is still underdevelopment and scarcity, we need a mechanism for distributing goods socially. Now, in the Soviet bloc, as I said, in the 1950s, there were a lot of debates about these questions. And the conclusion was that you should use market mechanisms to develop the productive forces. So use the market, use competition, material incentives, interest and credit and so on to develop industry to be more productive. And that was seen as a precondition to achieve developing a socialist consciousness. So they said, first we'll develop materially and then we'll develop in terms of consciousness. But Che's argument was that relying on the law of value or market to develop undermines the collective consciousness and obstructs the construction of socialism and communism. He argued that socialist countries need alternative levers to development. And he developed something called the budgetary finance system, which I mentioned. And it had really quite incredible, fascinating sets of policies, which were precisely to try and create a system which didn't rely on material incentives and competition and so on and so forth. So in my book, I've categorized these into 5 different areas, although all of these projects were running concurrently. which gives you an idea of how difficult and diverse the ministry was. But in education, the idea was to break the link between work and remuneration, the idea that you only work because you receive a salary, and that undermines the law of value, in the process decommodifying labour and equating self-improvement with social development. In terms of administrative controls, he believed that the plan should be formulated democratically by the workers, and then fulfillment should be ensured by a system of administrative controls. And many of these were adapted from management operations of those efficient capitalist corporations which he had studied. This should be combined with appeals to consciousness, and these are the main levers for increasing efficiency. So it's appeals to consciousness which really are responsible for increasing productivity. Administrative control ensures the primacy of planning, and that process undermines the operation of the law of value. In terms of...
Helen, sorry, I just asked...
Okay, sorry. In terms of projects to collectivise production, for Che, workers' management means workers' ownership. The question is, how do you transform what under capitalism is surplus value into what under socialism should still be a surplus, but it doesn't have the same relationship of exploitation, so it's a surplus product. And how do you move from production for exchange, where you're exchanging in order to profit, into production for use, so production has a social function? And this is a difficult dialectical process. Decentralizing management and control to workers who are nurtured under what Marx called the antagonism and alienation of capitalism. To expect them to subjugate their individual self-interest to their social well-being. In terms of policies and projects developed in the field of science and technology, Che recognised that capitalist competition revolutionises the productive forces, but socialism must find alternative drivers. And he sought those drivers within the Ministry of Industries. For example, 9 institutions were set up for science and development by Che in the Ministry of Industries. From everything from sort of mechanics to computing to green medicine. The idea was to promote endogenous development and the full chain of production. So Che wanted to go and search for metals under the ground and then use those as the basis of an industry to produce spare parts, which they could no longer get from the United States, and so on. Automation and centralization, he believed, created the potential for conscious and political control of the economy. Market forces would be replaced by planning. And finally, in the field where perhaps Che's work has been most stereotyped and misunderstood, is the field of consciousness, which is also linked to his projects in relation to psychology. He believed that there was a dialectical relationship between consciousness and production. The challenge is, of course, to replace alienation and antagonism, which is characteristic of capitalism, with integration and solidarity under socialism. And he developed a department of psychology because he believed that psychology could help to measure consciousness at the level of the individual and to evaluate the ability of managers to cope, to improve leadership and links between workers and management. There were also attempts to measure the impact of consciousness on productivity. We have to remember that many of these managers who took over newly nationalised state enterprises were people who had, before the revolution, no educational experience at all. They had been illiterate, they were from rural areas and so on. So it was a very big pressure for them to take these responsibilities. Okay, so as Che developed an alternative and unique system for economic management in Cuba, there were others in Cuba who defended this, the idea of just using the system developed in the Soviet Union. In Cuba, they tended to call that the auto-financing system, which was associated with that system in the USSR. And to stylize it, really, it meant self-management of entities, so factories, workshops, and so on, self-managed. They used financial or capitalist mechanisms. And compared with that, the budgetary finance system advocated by Guevara used administrative and political levers. Che criticized Soviet political economy at that time because he said it lacks both the efficiency of capitalism, because under capitalism, the profit motive, and because unlike capitalism, the profit motive and exploitation is restricted. And those are the things that kind of revolutionize capitalism, or at least give it its brutal efficiency. And at the same time, in the Soviet system, consciousness and social relations to do with socialism were also lacking. In his most scathing criticism of the Soviet Manual of Political Economy, which was their sort of guidebook of the economy, and these are notes that he actually wrote for himself, not for publication, and they were unseen for, I think, 40 years. He said, all the residues of capitalism are used to the maximum in order to eliminate capitalism. And he complains, dialectics is a science, not a joke. No one scientifically explains this contradiction. So just to be clear, for Che Guevara, socialism was a phenomena of both productivity and consciousness. Okay, so what happens when Che leaves Cuba? Well, in relation to his ideas and their endurance, we have essentially what you could call a pendulum. So Cuba swings at different periods closer to Che's ideas or further away. And I have broadly categorized these different periods, as you can see, if you can see the slide. The descriptions in blue represent a swing away from Che's ideas, and the periods in red represent a shift towards his ideas. And I think clearly the process of updating the economy under Raúl since 2006 has represented a shift away from essentially the Guevarista pendulum, although there are recently many complaints that this process perhaps seems to be shifting the other way. We'll see. Okay, now why does this shift happen? Well, I think we need to understand socialism as a transition period, and a transition that is not necessarily linear. So we can stylize the different stages as capitalism, socialism, and communism, where capitalism represents the private expropriation of social wealth. Socialism is characterized as by the slogan, from each according to their ability to each according to their work. You're rewarded still according to your work. And communism, which we have never seen so far, is a stage where there is no need for rationing the social product because we have abundance. So each gives according to their ability because we have a high consciousness, and each receives according to their needs because there's no need for rationing because we have abundance. Now, in terms of where we are in this linear transition period, there are internal and external factors which determine progress or retreat. The Cuban government has shown great flexibility in devising policies to deal with urgent problems, but without straying from the paradigm of Cuba Socialista. In Cuba, policy since '59 has been formulated, well, certainly since '61, within existing limits. And these limits are political commitments to socialist welfare, to state planning, to the predominance of state ownership, and anti-imperialist internationalism, which is in the Constitution. And on the other side, on the other set of constraints are economic constraints. So we have the US blockade. We have the fact we can't escape of trade dependency, being a small Caribbean island. The difficulty that Cuba has of obtaining credit, particularly with the blockade, and the low productivity in domestic production outside certain industries like biotechnology, for example. But this flexibility that Cuba has shown also reflects a lack of consensus about which are the best strategies for building socialism in a blockaded and trade-dependent island. The great debate, which I referred to, of the 1960s about which management system was appropriate for Cuba was never solved, was never resolved. Hence, some have referred to the debate in the contemporary period as a new great debate. It returns to many of the same themes addressed in the earlier period. For example, who owns and who controls production? Private accumulation versus social accumulation, or the plan versus the market. Are these opposites, or can they be complementary? How is distribution organised, and in whose interests? Where does the power lie, and what democratic structures exist? We also have the question of culture and consciousness. Do the market openings in Cuba today change social relations in Cuba? And what are the political objectives? Okay, so this is just a sort of outline of key points in the process of updating the model since 2011. I'm sure a lot of these things have been mentioned in your conference so far, so I'm not going to go through them. But just to be clear, that the aim is to increase the productivity and efficiency of socialism. Cuban policymakers estimate that a minimum annual growth rate of 5% is required to see significant socio-economic improvements and the kind of infrastructural developments necessary to raise the standard of living for the entire population. We can only really understand that need if we remember the devastation caused to the economy and infrastructure by the special period. However, between 2011 and 2015, the growth of GDP was only 2.7%. We know that last year it went into negative by nearly 1% for the first time since 1994. So to achieve the 5% growth rate, Cubans know they need an investment rate of 20%. Investment in economics is considered the same as the rate of saving, but the rate of saving in Cuba is half that. So the main point is that the Cuban government cannot find the capital that it needs for investment internally. It needs foreign direct investment. And it's striving for $2 to $2.5 billion of investment annually. And this is what explains the current drive to open up to world markets. Okay, so just briefly to say that there are three pillars of the updated model in Cuba. The first is the consolidation of the socialist state in its economic, political, and social aspects. The second is the introduction of a diversity of non-state forms. And the third is the primacy of planning, which, according to the Cuban documentation, takes into account the functioning of the market. And we're still yet to have a clarification of how planning is to take into account the functioning of the market. And as you can see, the debate remains the same in terms of whether planning and the market are opposites or can work together and be complementary, and what problems that arise from that. Okay, I just really briefly wanted to say that the US blockade is still the issue. I believe Arnold August probably mentioned something about the blockade, am I right? Yes? Okay, so I don't need to say that. Obviously, the United Nations vote takes place on Wednesday, and we hope, you know, I know that lots of protests are planned around North America. Okay, so challenges today. This is my final slide just to sum up. The economic reforms, that's a big challenge. How do they carry out the reforms with the intentions that I outlined, but while constraining market forces? How will Cuba secure foreign investment that it needs despite the US blockade and without compromising its sovereignty or socialist central planning? How will it maintain the commitment and engagement of Cuban youth? How the situation of instability in Venezuela and the restoration of the right in many countries in Latin America affect Cuba? The renewed aggression by Trump's stance on Cuba and Raul Castro's pending retirement, and the end of what's known in Cuba as the historic generation. So many challenges, but I would really argue that it's worth going back and looking at the work Che did and the arguments he developed, because I think they will help us to really understand those challenges of today. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you hear me, Helen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for that presentation. We are now going to open the floor for discussion. We have a microphone in the center of the room here, and we'll be welcoming people up to the microphone to ask you questions or to make comments. Again, I request that if you want to ask a question, that's great. If you'd like to make a comment, please do keep it to 2 minutes so that we have time for everyone. It's also getting a bit later there in London, so we are going to try and kind of stay on track. Our program is a little bit late, but we're doing well in general. So I think we'll take about 20 minutes for discussion, if that's okay with you, Helen. And
yeah, that's fine, no problem.
Wonderful. So I welcome Wendy Holm is up at the microphone.
Hi, I watched your presentation yesterday. It was very interesting. I watched it. It was nearly midnight. It was midnight, and I was watching from my bed in London.
Oh my God, you're very dedicated. Un mundo pequeño. I just wanted to ask if you could comment a little bit, Helen, on the challenge of integrating the currencies in Cuba. That is also part of what lies ahead.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that now, or are you taking a few?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extraordinarily complex question. I'm sure there are some financial economists that could probably explain the technical side to you better than me. I believe, though, that the process this implies has never actually taken place anywhere else in the world. So Cuba, you know, as in many of its projects, like the ones you were talking about last night, well, last night for me, it was during the day for you, you know, is sort of treading untrammeled ground. I think the question of currency unification is very important. It's important on an economic level and a political level, because in many ways, it's the first and most predominant complaint that the Cuban in the street will tell you about their socio-economic reality. The problem is, I was in Cuba in December, January earlier this year, and I was talking to Jose Luis Rodriguez, who, as you probably know, was the Minister of the Economy and Planning for many years, including that very difficult period of the special period and pulling Cuba out of the special period. And he was explaining to me that in order for the Cubans to honor their promise that no one would be affected detrimentally, no one would suffer a major loss of income or you know, what they have in the bank, Cuba needs a big buffer of money to be able to carry out the process of unification and protect the value of people's deposits in their bank accounts. And the issue, I think, is that Cuba has had other priorities in this period. It has, under Raúl's directorship, decided that dealing with its national debt was a real priority. And that's linked to some of the things I've been talking about. If they want to update infrastructure, if they want to see an increase in productivity, which is a precondition for the unification of currencies, they need to be able to get access to foreign capital and foreign investment. They can't do that unless they clear some of their very old and outstanding debts. So it's a very big problem because, you know, there are constant demands on Cuba's very limited financial and other resources. Then we've had the hurricanes, you know, and because it's a socialist society, they will prioritize now reparation of houses, importation of foodstuffs to cover, you know, what was lost in the hurricanes and so on. But I think the key issues, everyone in Cuba recognizes the importance of unification of currencies. And, you know, we were told in 2013 it would happen within 3 years. And now I believe it won't happen for another 4 or 5 years.
Thank you very much. I have an open microphone. Somebody needs to get courageous and ask a question.
Please ask a question.
It was a very comprehensive talk, but here we go. We've got some people coming to the microphone now. Okay, Henry, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to ask a question. Aren't the like I very much enjoyed and it was extremely illuminating, this talk, especially the updating of the development of the economy. I've read your book, but the way you recounted the last years and how it fits into the overall history of this. We need to know more about the history of economic planning in Cuba. I mean, the whole history of this is amazing, and potentially, I hope perhaps you can do that, is a very important example for other countries. The whole struggle that has gone on here is an amazing story. But isn't the question seem to be, in a way, political at this moment? I mean, the relationship with Venezuela. When I was in Cuba last summer, I noticed how important the fuel trucks and the distribution of oil from Venezuela is. So the struggle in Venezuela that is going on at the moment is vitally linked to what is possible for the Cuban economy. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think there was a mischaracterization that was made largely by, you know, Cuba's critics or enemies, which was that Cuba had recreated the dependency that it had on the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries on Venezuela, when actually, if you look at the statistics, that was not the case at all. The Cuban economy, in terms of imports and its export market, was never anywhere near as dependent on Venezuela. But it's quite clear, and Raúl Castro has made it clear, that the economic problems and political instability, which are both linked in Venezuela, have negatively impacted on Cuba. But, you know, Cuba is fighting for the Bolivarian revolution to survive. It's vitally important that the Bolivarian revolution survives, not just in terms of, you know, Cuba's economy, but because Cuba has a commitment to internationalism, and it had developed an ally, a political ally, an anti-imperialist ally, or Venezuela among a number of them in Latin America. And it was carving out a space for, you know, resistance, and for carving a space in which they were able to experiment with different kinds of organization and production and management, and questions about, you know, social control and political control and social relations. So, you know, if you look, it's quite clear. There was also another question when rapprochement took place with Obama. There were people who asked, you know, what price will Cuba pay in order to pursue rapprochement? Well, Cuba never paid any price. They didn't pay a price. They didn't compromise anything for that process of rapprochement to start out. In fact, as Marco Rubio and all those people were, you know, the Cuban American senators, let's just say, were complaining, you know, that all the concessions had been made on the US side. What's really interesting is Cuba has never dropped its vociferous support for the Bolivarian Revolution and for President Maduro and the legacy of Chavez. And I think that is a sign that Cuba understands that it is its principled internationalism which has garnered support from around the world, which in some senses pushed the United States into sitting down at the table to have talks with Cuba. And why would they give that up? That's their position of strength.
Thank you, Helen. I think that those are very important points. I have 3 people at the microphone, so I'm going to let each of them make their comments. If you can just take notes, and then we'll get you to respond, and we will... Oh, I have a 4th person at the microphone. All right. And then we'll have to cut off the line there and move on to our lunch. Go ahead.
I wanted to say there's a lot of foreign banks and businesses that are not allowed to do business with Cuba, or else, you know, they'll get a large fine for doing business with Cuba. And anyway, Latin America is making some progress in regard to that, and, you know, with their own organizations like Mercosur and other organizations where different Latin American countries is getting rid of American imperialism and getting their own organizations so they can work out their economy without having to deal with American imperialism. I was wondering, do you think your business and banks will be able to get some organizations that do business with Cuba without interference with Yankee imperialism?
Okay, thank you, Stan. We're going to take the other comments, and then Helen will respond all together. Thank you.
And this is probably a much more complicated question, but one of the possible answers is go read my book. In the slides that you have...
Sorry, who are you and what's your book, please? I can't actually see you very well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought she'd written the book.
She meant your response to her might be read my book. Like you will tell her she has to read your book to understand this question.
I thought she said I should read her book, and I said I don't know who it is.
Believe me, no, that is not what I meant. So when you had the slides up, particularly, you know, the 2 slides of the top line was 1960 something to 1965, and then the next slide I think started with 2011. And what I would love to know is on those slides, what were the things that really worked, and what were the things that really worked? Like and particularly in the previous slide, you had you were kind of showing.
This one.
No, that one. So
yeah.
Blue is when they were going towards Che's ideas, or going away. Okay. Away. And then red is they're going towards Che's ideas. So clearly, what's happening here is that some things are working, and some things aren't. And I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit better idea, and if it's a little shorter, to use the one that starts with 2000, the next slide that starts with 2011, to kind of give us an idea of which of Che's ideas were the easiest to adopt in practicality. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very engaging and very interesting. I would like to refer to one item that stands out to me, and that was presented on your first slide when you were referring to what I interpreted as chess puzzle, how to create consciousness and development. Now, we all speak about development, economic development. It seems to be sort of an easier topic to tackle and to present and to discuss. But the topic of consciousness, which for me as a socialist seems to be fundamental, it's very, very important and very more tricky maybe to handle and to explain. For instance, in Cuba, you know, I would have some fear that, in fact, there might be some infiltration from the empire in terms of changing the consciousness that has been created by the Cuban Revolution. At the same time, I see Venezuela as trying to really hard to create a sense of consciousness, socialist consciousness, which seems to be very difficult and very much challenges. So I wonder if you have some more insights about that, or more comments, and that you could bring to enlighten me. Thank you.
Okay, we have one last speaker on the microphone, and then we'll give you a chance to wrap up. That's a lot to answer there, Helen.
Yeah, tourism has replaced, I understand, as a major industry in Cuba that replaced the sugar industry. Now we know that the social, political, and economics are the dynamics of these three are intertwined. So my question is, what is the impact of tourism in this dynamics of political, social, and economic situation in Cuba?
Okay, wonderful. So, Helen, I will let you answer that. I did just want to let people know that I have been informed we only have one copy of Helen's book left. They were great. They sent us 4 copies of the book, and so we've already sold 3 of them. And so if you were hoping to get it, I see people already running to the table. Okay. Uh-oh. I may have created a crisis, Helen. We might have to get a link later for online book sales. Okay. Anyways, please go ahead.
You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon. It might even be cheaper. Okay. All right. That's quite a lot to deal with. It's like all the big, difficult questions related to Cuba. I'll start with the question of the US blockade and how it impacts on banks and businesses. So, yes, we know under Obama, fines were greater than they had been under any other US president. That's fines against US and any companies in the world for trading with Cuba. Yes, the importance of Latin America, of these regional integration in multilateral institutions, was precisely because it was one way of closing down the sphere of influence of the United States and US imperialism and generating a forum, a market within which Cuba could operate. But, you know, there has been a concerted effort to replace progressive and left-wing governments in the main countries driving that process with right-wing governments who are very strongly allied with US imperialism. So that has been a real setback for Cuba. For Alba, it's been a setback for Alba. Alba itself has been set back. In terms of Europe, well, this is something I've been writing some articles and letters about recently. It's really interesting to note that it is illegal in Europe and illegal in the UK to implement the US blockade. And yet, it is done on a daily basis. So I was involved helping a organisation, Cubans in the UK, who were trying to send a grand piano, which they wanted to raise money to buy to send to the Amadeo Rodan music school in Havana. It's a prestigious music school, but the last new piano that entered was 30 years ago. And, you know, they organised a classical music concert. Tickets were sold with Eventbrite, which is a US company, although they have some sort of office in Europe. And they literally stole the money from the ticket sales. They said, we cannot give this to you because their bank is terrified of the fine it will get from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls of the US Treasury. And that was in March 2016. Subsequently, in September 2017, they've had a similar response from GoFundMe and Stripe. And, you know, there are PayPal has closed down the account of Rock Around the Blockade, Solidarity Campaign. The Cooperative Bank has closed the account of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. So actually, you have this ridiculous situation where UK and European law and the national laws of most countries in the world say it is illegal for the US blockade regulations to be imposed on their citizens and businesses based in those countries. And yet they do nothing. So the blockade continues to be enacted, mainly by the fear factor that companies and banks are too scared to trade with Cuba. Now, as far as I know, in Europe, there has been just one exception, and that was in Germany, that a provincial or local court took PayPal, their European wing, to court and demanded that they return some money they had confiscated from a group who was doing an event that was about Cuba. And they threatened to fine them with €250,000 if they didn't return that money. But, you know, that wasn't even reported in English. And the British government has certainly not taken any inspiration from that. So I think it's something, I don't know what the situation is in Canada. I'm sure it's also illegal to implement the blockade in Canada. I think it's something that all of us have a responsibility to do in our own countries, is demand from our own governments that they do not allow the extraterritorial character of the US blockade to be implemented, because, you know, it remains there as a major disincentive. There was a German bank that got fined recently, a massive amount of money. What was it? Commerce Bank got fined $1.7 billion in 2015, and subsequently it blocked payments to Cuba for medical services that Cuba had provided for infants and maternity to Algeria. So Cuba lost over, you know, nearly $2 million worth of payment for its medical services in Algeria. So it, you know, it's a battle we all need to take on. In terms of the question about the pendulum, it is very complicated, and there is a chapter in my book which is about Che's legacy in Cuba, and it deals with what happened in each situation. But I think it wouldn't be correct or fair to think in terms of taking Che's policies and applying them to Cuba today or at any other time. What we can do is adopt his approach, not the actual policies. Because one thing about Marxism is it has to be concrete. It has to reflect reality. And that's the other point I was making, is that the reality has changed according to not just domestic, but also external circumstances. And those circumstances determine what is possible. Sometimes this has involved mistakes of miscomprehension of Che's system. So, for example, in 1967, when the registry system was implemented in Cuba, it was reflected a total misunderstanding of what Che's system was about, and it led to the opposite of what he argued for. He argued for very controlled accounting and cost control, and that was all out the window, and it led to a certain amount of chaos in the economy. In terms of rectification, I mean, I would encourage everyone to read the amazing speech that Fidel Castro made on the 20th anniversary of Fidel Castro's death, Che Guevara's death in 1987, where he says very directly, you know, had we understood Che's arguments, had we implemented them, we would be 1,000 times better off today than we are. And he calls on people in Cuba, in Latin America, and even, he says, in the capitalist countries, I urge you, go and read Che's economic works. So, you know, and then, unfortunately, the process of rectification doesn't really have the opportunity to develop, because we have the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and Cuba is thrown into an economic crisis. So that's an external factor. It doesn't reflect a political preference. And I would say that in terms of the last blue, the updating the economy, and this whole period here, again, you know, Cuba has been isolated. It's a phenomenal fact that it managed to survive the special period, and to really turn things around and recover. And I think, you know, Wendy's talk about agriculture, and I haven't heard the other talks, but I'm looking at what Cuba's been doing in renewable energies and in biotechnology, and the way that they turned to those resources really to get out of the special period is really quite a phenomenal story that needs to be told. In terms of consciousness, yes, I mean, consciousness is the challenge, isn't it? Essentially, that's the whole point. Because we talk about a society where, you know, people work with a concept of social duty, or they work for the benefit of others. But, you know, how do you create that consciousness in people who are brought up in the dog-eat-dog of capitalism, alienation and antagonism, as Marx described it? In terms of infiltration, you asked about infiltration by the empire. I assume you mean in Cuba today. And, you know, there is a concern that even top Cubans leading, you know, academic and political institutions will say there is a concern about the level of engagement of the youth. But, you know, then we can look at some astonishing developments or facts or expressions of consciousness among Cuban youth. So, for example, when, or just Cubans, when the Ebola outbreak took place in West Africa, and, you know, as always happens with internationalist missions, a call goes out for volunteers, and they have to be volunteers because they are going to risk their lives going to an extremely difficult environment, very far from home, different culture, different languages, and so on. And do you know how many Cubans volunteered to go and fight Ebola in West Africa? And of course, they had to have medical training. 10,000 Cubans volunteered. I mean, you know, if that doesn't reflect consciousness, I mean, if that doesn't reflect the kind of consciousness that we, you know, we really want to see and that we think Cuba represents, then I don't know what else does, because, you know, that was just a phenomenal display. I mean, another thing, I spoke to a Cuban who I was interviewing recently from the sort of foreign ministry, and who was talking about this question of, you know, youth engagement or alienation. And she said, if you talk, I was in Cuba a few weeks after Fidel Castro had died. And she said to me, if you talked to me a month ago, I might have been more pessimistic. But the response that I've seen to the Comandante's death has really made me so inspired by the commitment of Cuban youth, you know, and I think hopefully we all saw a bit of that. So, of course, it is a very, very difficult thing because, you know, the enemies of Cuba will use all tactics, every tactic. Look at this business about the sonic attacks now in Cuba, which the Cuban scientists have now just said it's science fiction, you know? So they will use every technique. I mean, I remember being in Cuba in the 1990s and suddenly seeing Nike ticks appearing like graffiti all over the place. But, you know, then I found out that people were being paid a few dollars to do a tick, right? Because that is part of the ideological warfare against Cuba, right? And how do you combat that materialistic values? Well, you know, I think the solidarity movement, we can't answer that question internally, but we can certainly make a contribution. We can go to Cuba on our brigades or as individuals, and we can talk to them a little bit about the reality in our countries. You know, I think Cubans are extremely well educated and knowledgeable about the situation in the underdeveloped world, but there is perhaps a misconception about a sort of shared wealthy standard of living in the advanced capitalist countries and imperialist countries. And, you know, when they either come to our countries and see the reality of poverty, racism, drug and mental health problems, you know, it's a shock to their system. So I think that we need to be doing that, playing our part by really communicating our realities to them as well. And the final question, I think, was the impact of tourism. Again, it's another difficult area. There's nothing that I could say about it, either as a problem or a solution that the Cubans themselves couldn't say. They're well aware of the sort of two sides of that coin. Tourism has been essential for the economy, of course, but it goes along with the issue of the dual currency in sort of distorting the Cuban economy and distorting social relations in Cuba, because you have people who have trained, they've received free training from the government as scientists and technicians and medics or lawyers, whatever it is, and they've left their professional sector to go and work in the tourist industry because that's where the hard currency is. Now, obviously, the one big step to solve that problem will be the unification of the currencies. But as I've been explaining, that's extraordinarily complex, and Cuba doesn't quite have the reserve that it needs at this moment to achieve that. But, you know, I think, I don't know, perhaps there are, it's not so negative, the impact of tourism. You know, it's an exchange, isn't it? It would be a mistake to just think that, you know, what happens is that foreigners get to Cuba and pollute them with their consumerism and individualism, because actually I think there's probably perhaps more of an exchange the other way. I mean, how many of us don't know people who would regard themselves as unpolitical, but have gone to Cuba and just felt the culture and the spirit of, you know, a much more socialist society, a society much more interested in equality and social justice. You know, very few people will go to Cuba without leaving and having the desire to return. So I think, you know, that is another impact to consider. I think the Cubans have been quite intelligent in the way they've developed their tourist industry. They've realized that they can politicize tourists to an extent. So most of the hotels now, or certainly until a couple of years ago, had, you know, photos of the Cuban Five. They have photos of the Cuban Revolution. They talk about the literacy campaign. So, you know, that's been quite a valuable thing for Cuba to do, to sort of generalize a bit of knowledge about its struggle and its revolution. I don't really know what else to say about that tourism, really. I hope that's answered some of your questions.
That was really great. I know someone who asked a question wants to follow up, but maybe you could do that kind of one-on-one if you're able to stay with us for another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Did you? Oh, yeah. We're already right now about 40 minutes behind schedule, so I got to try and get us back on track here. So, Helen, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
No, just that I hope you're having a great weekend, and I wish I could be with you. And you know, I hope everyone's inspired by the weekend, and we've got a lot of work to do.
That's right. Okay, thank you so much, Helen, for Skyping with us. It's great to have you all the way from London, England, and this technology is really amazing. The presentation was very clear, really easy for all of us to hear what you were saying and to communicate with the PowerPoint, and everything was fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us. And we really have sold out of books. So we are going to post a link to your book on Amazon. So if anyone wasn't able to get a copy today and you'd like a copy of Helen Yaffe's Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, we will post that link up on our Facebook and on our Twitter, and people can go and get their copy online. So thank you again so much, Helen.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, we are running right now about 35 minutes behind schedule, but I know lunch is very important and nutrition is very important. And not only that, but today today we have Today we have a special Cuban lunch. We're very honored that a local Cuban made us Cuban tamales and a special soup as well. So we're very lucky to have some amazing Cuban food. It is by donation, and so please, if you can contribute, then do. If you've already spent all of your money on books and other things, then you're welcome to eat for free. But please do enjoy the food, and we'll come back at 2:15. So we'll try and get ourselves a little bit more back on schedule, coming back at 2:15. Thank you.